My parents made my twin brother the judge of whether my feelings were real. I'm his sister, and I'm finally telling Julian's story because he asked me to. Posted to r/true off my chest.
My name is not important right now.
What is important is my brother Julian, and what was done to him inside the home we both grew up in, and the fact that he has spent the last several years finding his way back to himself after something that took me far too long to understand was not normal, was not okay, and was not something either of us should have simply accepted as the way our family worked. Julian asked me to write this. He said he wanted the story told in someone else's voice for once, because he has told it himself so many times now. In therapy, in the speeches he gives, in the small conversations he has with young people who recognize something of themselves in what he describes, and he said that hearing it from the outside might help some people understand what this kind of thing looks like when you are not the one living it. When you are the sibling on the other side of it. When you are, without fully understanding it for years, a participant in something that was harming your brother every single day. I am Ethan's twin sister. Yes, I said sister. There are three of us, Julian, Ethan, and me. We are not identical triplets, because identical triplets is not how that works, but we were born within minutes of each other, and we grew up as a unit. What our parents built in our house affected all three of us, but it targeted Julian in a way that I need to sit with honestly. Because I watched it. And for a long time, I told myself I did not fully understand what I was watching. That is the part one have had to work on in my own therapy. But this post is not about me. This post is about Julian. Let me start at the beginning. Our mother, Linda, is a woman who I love and who has caused real damage, and who I am still figuring out how to hold simultaneously. Our father, Richard, is a quieter presence in this story, not innocent, because silence in the face of harm is its own kind of harm, but less active in what happened. Linda was the architect. She was the one who decided, when we were 7 years old, that the household needed a system. I remember the conversation, or some version of it. We were at the dinner table. Julian had come home from school upset. He had been called a name by another kid, something small in the grand taxonomy of childhood cruelty, but significant to a 7-year-old who felt it sharply. He was crying. And our mother looked at him, and then looked at Ethan. Ethan, who was quieter than Julian, less expressive, more contained in the particular way some children are, and said something that I have thought about 1,000 times since. She said that Ethan seemed to handle his feelings very calmly, and that Julian could learn from that, and that maybe it would help Julian to check in with Ethan before getting too upset about things, to make sure his reaction was appropriate. That was how it started. Not with cruelty. Not with intention to harm. With a mother who had decided that one of her children's emotional styles was correct and another's was excessive, and who constructed a rule to bring the excessive one into alignment. The rule, as it was formally established over the following weeks, worked like this. When Julian experienced a strong emotional reaction to something, he was required to describe the situation to Ethan and ask Ethan to assess whether his feelings were proportionate and genuine. If Ethan said yes, Julian would receive what her mother called comfort, usually a brief acknowledgement, a hug, permission to feel what he was feeling. If Ethan said no, or said Julian was overreacting, Julian would be sent to his room to calm down, and depending on how upset he remained, there could be additional consequences. Losing screen time. Earlier bedtime. Being told he was being manipulative. I am describing this calmly because Julian asked me to describe it calmly. He said the thing that helps people understand the damage is not the dramatic moments, but the ordinariness of it. The way it was just the rule. The way it became as ambient as any other household structure. I was 7 when it started. I did not have the language or the framework to understand what I was watching. By the time I did, it had been the rule for years, and the rule had become the texture of our home. The early experiences were subtle enough that I think even Julian minimized them at the time, the way children minimize things that are painful when the alternative is understanding that the people responsible for your safety are doing something wrong. He came home from school one afternoon, around 2nd grade, with that particular quiet that meant something had happened. A group of kids had started calling him a nickname he hated, something that played on his name in a way designed to diminish him, and he had spent the day holding it together and came through our front door with his jaw tight and his eyes bright. He went through the rule. He sat across from Ethan at the kitchen table while our mother stood in the doorway, and he described what had happened in the careful way he had already learned to describe things, leaving out anything that might sound excessive, framing it as reasonably as a 7-year-old could. Ethan said it did not seem that bad. He said people got called names all the time. He said Julian was probably making it bigger than it was. Julian was sent to his room. I remember standing in the hallway afterward, not knowing what to do with what I had watched. I knocked on his door later that night, and he was doing homework, very focused, very closed. I said I was sorry about the kids at school. He said it was fine. He said Ethan was probably right. He said he was probably overreacting. He was 7 years old. The moment I return to most often, the one that I think represents most clearly what this rule was capable of destroying, happened when we were 9. We had a dog named Cooper. Cooper was a golden retriever of the most golden retriever kind. Large, gentle, perpetually delighted by his own existence. Julian loved Cooper with the particular intensity that some children reserve for animals, the way animals become the repository for feelings that have nowhere else safe to go. He had grown up alongside Cooper. They slept in the same room. Julian talked to Cooper in a low, private voice that he did not use with people, and Cooper always looked back at him with the patient, complete attention that dogs give when they understand they are being confided in. Cooper got sick when we were 9. It was fast, the way these things sometimes are, and then it was over. Our parents told us on a Saturday morning. Julian's grief was immediate and total. He cried in the way children cry when something enormous has happened and there is no containing it, the kind of crying that is not performance but pure response. And then our mother, because the rule existed and because the rule was the rule, said it was time to check in with Ethan. I want you to hold that for a moment. A 9-year-old boy who had just been told his dog was dead, being required to submit his grief for assessment. Julian sat across from Ethan. He described, through tears, how he felt. Ethan, and I say this as someone who loves my brother Ethan but who has had to see him clearly. Ethan looked at him with a slightly detached expression he had developed for these assessments, the one that had become his face for the rule, and said that Cooper was just a dog, and that Julian's reaction was too big for what had happened. Our mother sent Julian to his room. I stood in the living room after he went down the hall, and I felt something I did not have a name for. I was 9 years old, and I did not know the word injustice, but I knew the feeling of it, the way it sits in the chest like something swallowed wrong. I did not do anything. I did not say anything to my mother or my father or Ethan. I went to my own room, and I sat on my bed, and I listened to the quiet coming from Julian's room, which was somehow worse than if he had been crying. He came out at dinner. He ate. He did not speak about Cooper. He did not speak about Cooper for weeks, and when he did it was always in the same measured, contained way, as if he had filed the grief somewhere internal where it could not be assessed and ruled inappropriate. I understand now that this is what systematic invalidation does. It does not eliminate feelings. It teaches you to hide them so thoroughly that eventually you begin to hide them from yourself. By the time we reached high school, the rule had done its work so completely that Julian did not need to be reminded of it. He had internalized it. The question was not just what Ethan would say, it was the prior question, the one Julian asked himself before he even knew what he was feeling. Is this real? Is this too much? Am I overreacting again? Julian loved basketball. He had played since middle school, and he was genuinely talented. He had the quickness and the court vision that coaches respond to, and by freshman year, he was practicing harder than almost anyone else on the team. When the varsity coach posted the JV list and Julian's name was not on the varsity roster, he came home with the same carefully contained quiet I had known since we were children. He went through the rule. He sat across from Ethan and explained that he had worked hard all summer and expected to make varsity and had not, and that it was disappointing. Ethan said he seemed fine during tryouts and probably the coach just had a lot of good options and it was not a big deal. He said Julian should be grateful to be on the team at all. Julian nodded. He did the extra practice. He worked harder. He did not let himself be disappointed in any visible way because visible disappointment had been ruled disproportionate. His junior year, when he finally made varsity, there was no one he felt he could fully celebrate with. He had trained himself out of the emotional access required for celebration the same way he had trained himself out of the access required for grief. The anxiety attacks started around sophomore year. They were quiet at first, something Julian described to me much later as a feeling of pressure behind his sternum that arrived without warning and made the world narrow and bright and too loud all at once. He did not tell our parents, because telling them would have meant going through the rule, and he had a pretty clear sense of what Ethan would say about anxiety. He did not tell his friends, because he had learned to be careful with his friends about anything that might reveal how much he felt and how little he trusted those feelings. He told me, once, in the way he told me things in those years, which was obliquely and late at night, and with a lot of exits available in case the conversation became too much. He said he had been feeling weird lately. He said he thought something might be wrong with him. He said sometimes he couldn't breathe right. I said he should tell Mom. He looked at me with an expression I have thought about many times since. Not anger, not blame, just a very tired and very certain patience. The expression of someone who knows exactly what will happen and does not need to explain why he will not be doing that. I said nothing more. I went to bed. I have had to forgive myself for that, and I am still working on it. The intervention that changed Julian's life happened in October of junior year, in a way that none of us saw coming. His AP history class required a presentation. Julian was not a poor student. He was sharp and curious, and had the kind of mind that understood systems and patterns. But the anxiety that had been building for 2 years had attached itself particularly to the idea of being evaluated in front of people, which makes a specific and terrible kind of sense when you understand that Julian had spent nearly a decade having his reactions evaluated by an audience. The presentation triggered something he could not manage through the containment strategies he had spent years developing. He had a panic attack in the hallway outside the classroom before he went in. Not the quiet internal kind he had been managing on his own, the full, visible kind, the kind that puts you on the floor with your back against the lockers and your hands shaking and your vision closing in at the edges. His teacher saw it. She got him to the guidance office. And the guidance counselor on duty that day was Mrs. Carmen Alvarez. Julian has told me about Mrs. Alvarez many times. He says she was the first adult outside our home who saw him without a filter. He sat in her office still shaking, and she did not ask him what was wrong with him, or tell him to calm down, or suggest he was overreacting. She sat with him until the worst of it passed, and then she asked him what had been going on. Julian told her some of it. Not all of it. He did not have the language for all of it, and some of it he had normalized so completely that he did not think it was relevant. But he told her about the anxiety, about the presentations, about feeling like he did not trust his own emotional responses. Mrs. Alvarez asked careful questions. She asked how long he had felt this way. She asked whether there were situations at home that he found difficult. She asked, gently, whether there was anyone at home who made him feel like his feelings were not valid. Julian told her about the rule. He told me later that he said it the way you say something you do not fully expect another person to react to, matter-of-factly as context, the way you describe the furniture in your house. He said it was just how things worked at home. He said Ethan helped him calibrate. Mrs. Alvarez, to her enormous credit, did not maintain a neutral expression. She did not normalize it or move past it or file it as family quirk. She asked Julian to tell her more, and she listened very carefully, and at the end of the conversation, she told him something that Julian says altered the entire geography of how he understood his own life. She said, "What you're describing is a form of emotional abuse. It has a name. And it is not your fault, and it is not because your feelings are too big. It is because someone decided to use your brother to teach you not to trust yourself." Julian sat with that for a long time. He told me she said it quietly and without drama, which was part of why it landed. Not an explosion, but an identification. A name for something that had been happening for 10 years without a name. Mrs. Alvarez contacted the Department of Child Services. This was, she explained to Julian before she did it, her obligation as a mandated reporter. Julian said he felt terrified when she told him, not because he did not believe her about the rule, but because naming it to an institution made it real in a different way, and real in a different way meant the version of family he had grown up inside was going to change shape, and change, even when the current shape is harmful, is frightening when you have known nothing else. The DCS caseworker who came to our home was named Terrence Okafor. I remember him clearly. A tall man with a careful, unhurried quality, the kind of person who seems to understand that the pace of a conversation matters as much as its content. He interviewed each of us separately, which was its own kind of revelation. It was the first time I had been asked, by an adult with authority, what I had observed in our household. It was the first time I told the truth about it fully out loud, to someone outside the family. I told him everything I have told you in this post. About Cooper.
About the basketball team.
About the night Julian told me he couldn't breathe right, and I told him to talk to Mom. I cried through some of it, which surprised me because I had not understood until I was saying it aloud how much I had been holding. Terrence Okafor was gentle but unambiguous. He interviewed our parents. He interviewed Ethan. He interviewed Julian. At the end of his assessment, he mandated two things: family therapy, to be conducted by a licensed therapist with experience in family systems and emotional dynamics, and individual therapy for Julian with a trauma specialist. The individual therapist he referred Julian to was a woman named Dr. Yuki Tanaka. Julian has talked about Dr. Tanaka the way some people talk about people who save their lives, which I think is accurate and which I think she would be uncomfortable with because from what Julian describes, she is exactly the kind of person who redirects that credit back to the person doing the work. Julian started seeing Dr. Tanaka weekly. The early sessions were, by his account, difficult in the way that true beginnings are difficult, not because Dr. Tanaka was unkind, but because the work required him to locate feelings he had spent years burying in the specific place where feelings go when they have been declared invalid too many times. He said the first time she asked him how something made him feel, and then just waited, without commenting or qualifying or preparing to assess his answer, he did not know what to say. He said it took him several sessions to understand that the waiting was not a trap. Dr. Tanaka gave Julian a framework that he has described to me in pieces over the years. The framework named what had happened as systematic invalidation, a sustained, repeated pattern of having his emotional responses evaluated, found wanting, and punished, which had produced in Julian a deep and foundational distrust of his own internal experience. She explained that the panic attacks were, in part, his nervous system's response to years of operating in a state of low-level alarm, never knowing whether what he felt was real or whether it would be taken from him. She helped him understand that his feelings had always been real, that the problem was never the size of his feelings, that no feeling has a correct size because feelings are not subject to calibration by anyone other than the person having them. Julian told me once that the first time Dr. Tanaka said that to him directly, "Your feelings are yours and they are always valid, regardless of what anyone else decides about them," he cried for most of the session. He said he was not sure whether he was crying about believing it or about all the years of not believing it. I think it was both. The family therapy sessions were, in Julian's words and in mine, exactly as uncomfortable as they needed to be. Our mother, Linda, arrived at the first session with the posture of a woman who was prepared to explain that she had meant well, which she had, and which is important and also insufficient. She described the rule as a teaching tool, as something she had designed to help Julian regulate, as an intervention born from love. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Patricia Weiss, who had the particular skill of letting people hear themselves speak without immediate interference, let her finish. And then Dr. Weiss asked her how she had determined that Ethan's emotional baseline was the correct one. Our mother paused. She said Ethan was naturally calmer. Dr. Weiss asked whether calm was the same as correct. Another pause. She asked our mother whether she had considered that Julian's larger emotional responses might be his natural baseline rather than evidence of something requiring correction. I watched my mother sit with that question. I watched something move across her face that I had not seen there before, not quite recognition, not yet, but the early displacement of a certainty that had been in place for a very long time. Ethan, in those sessions, was resistant in the specific way of someone who has benefited from a system and cannot yet see the benefit as harm. He maintained that he had only done what he was asked to do. He said the rule was Mom's rule, not his. He said he had been honest in his assessments. Dr. Weiss did not argue with any of this. She simply asked him to consider what it might feel like to have your grief over your dog's death ruled disproportionate by your brother. Ethan said he did not see how that was connected to anything he had done. I do not have clarity on what Ethan understood or did not understand in those sessions. I only know what I observed, And what I observed was a person who was working very hard to locate the place where his role in the system ended and someone else's began, and who was not finding it. Julian healed slowly, which is the only honest way to describe it, and he healed in the way that people heal when they are doing the real work rather than the performed version of it. It was not linear. There were months that were harder than the months before them. There were moments in sophomore and junior year of the therapy process when the panic attacks got worse before they got better, which Dr. Tanaka had prepared him for. She said that when you begin to access feelings that have been contained for years, they do not emerge in orderly sequence, and Julian had about a decade of deferred emotional experience to move through. But there were also the first moments of what Julian calls retrieval. The first time he felt sad about something and let himself feel it without immediately asking whether it was too much. The first time he was disappointed and allowed the disappointment to exist in his body for more than a moment before trying to fold it away. He described these moments as small and enormous simultaneously. Small because they were ordinary human experiences, enormous because they were ordinary human experiences that had been taken from him for most of his childhood and that he was having for the first time. He started painting during this period. Julian had always drawn, but something in the therapeutic work opened a different channel, and he began making large, color-saturated pieces that he described as attempts to make feelings visible. He gave some of them names that told their story. One was called Proportionate, which was mostly gray and white with a single bright red shape at the center that looked like it was trying to get out. One was called Calibration, which showed two figures at a table, one with an enormous shadow and one with no shadow at all. He hung them in his room first, and then, eventually, let them out into the world. A local gallery agreed to show 4 of them when Julian was 19. He gave a short talk at the opening. He was terrified, he told me, in a way that was completely different from the pre-presentation panic attacks. This was the clean terror of vulnerability chosen rather than forced, which he said felt like something it was possible to walk toward. He spoke for about 8 minutes about what the paintings were and where they had come from and what he had understood in making them. There were maybe 30 people in the room. Several of them came to speak to him afterward, and more than one of them said some version of, "I know this. You're describing something I know." That was the beginning of his advocacy work, though he did not call it that yet. The reconciliation attempt happened 4 years after the DCS involvement. Julian was 21. Our mother requested a meeting, just the 2 of them, no therapist, no mediation, at a coffee shop near our childhood home. Julian agreed, partly because Dr. Tanaka had helped him understand that he was strong enough to have the meeting and that choosing to have it did not mean choosing to forgive anything prematurely. He told me about it the same night. He called me on his way home and talked for 40 minutes. Linda had cried. She had said that she had spent 4 years in therapy of her own, working through what Dr. Weiss and the family sessions had brought up for her, and that she understood now, in a way she had not when she designed the rule, that she had taken something from him that she could not give back. She said she had been afraid of Julian's emotions since he was very young. She had found his emotional intensity overwhelming, and she had mistaken her own discomfort with his feelings for evidence that his feelings were incorrect. She said she knew that was not an excuse. She said she was sorry in a way that Julian said was not the sorry of someone hoping to be immediately absolved, but the sorry of someone who had truly sat with what she had done. Julian told me he had not said much in response to the apology. He had listened. He had told her that he heard her. He had not told her that everything was okay because it was not okay, and he is not a person who will say something is okay when it is not. He told her that he hoped her work in therapy was real and that he would be in touch and that he needed to continue moving at his own pace. He has maintained limited contact with Linda since then. Occasional phone calls. A holiday here and there. He does not go home. He does not pretend the past did not happen. But he has left a door open that is sized to what he can currently manage, and that, Dr. Tanaka has told him, is not failure or weakness. It is the precise and self-protective kind of love that he has earned the right to. Ethan is different. Ethan never called. Ethan never wrote. In the years since the DCS involvement and the family therapy and the public work Julian has done with his art and his speaking, Ethan has not once reached out to acknowledge Julian's experience or his own role in it. when I have raised it with him, and I have raised it because I am his sister, and I love him, and I needed to try. He has said that he was a child following their parents' rules, that he did not create the system, and that Julian has made a career out of something that was not as bad as he makes it sound. Julian cut contact with Ethan 2 years ago. Not in a dramatic or announced way. He simply stopped reaching out, and when Ethan did not reach out either, the silence formalized itself into the shape of an ending. Julian told me that the decision was not made in anger. He said he made it from the same place he makes most of his decisions now, from a clear-eyed understanding of what is good for him and what is not. He said, I can love him and still understand that being in relationship with him requires me to hold open the question of whether my experiences are real. And I am done holding that question open. I know they are real. I worked very hard to know that. I had nothing to add to that. I still do not. Julian is 26 now. He works part-time as a youth arts facilitator at a community center and spends the rest of his time on his advocacy work, which has grown from that gallery opening into something I am still a little awed by. He speaks at schools and community events and occasionally at conferences on childhood trauma and emotional development. He has a website where he posts his paintings and essays, and where he is building something that I think will matter for a long time. He is in a relationship with a kind, patient man named Samuel who, Julian says, is the first person he has been with who does not trigger the old assessment loop, who says, "How are you feeling about that?" and means it as a question rather than a test. He has 2 cats who he loves with a particular completeness that I recognize from his relationship with Cooper, and watching him with those cats is one of the things that makes me feel that something has been returned to him that was taken. He is not done healing. He would be the first to tell you that. He still has sessions with Dr. Tanaka now monthly rather than weekly, and he still has difficult periods, though they are different now, less about not trusting his feelings and more about the ordinary difficulty of being a person in the world. He would tell you that there is a difference between those 2 things, and that understanding the difference is its own form of progress. I want to say something before I close, and I want to say it carefully, because I have thought about it for a long time. My role in Julian's story is not comfortable for me to hold. I was there. I watched the rule in operation for years. I saw Cooper and the basketball list and the hallway quiet after every assessment Julian went through and lost. I told him once to talk to Mom about the anxiety and did not push when he declined, and I went to bed. I did not design the rule, and I did not administer it, but I was present, and for a long time my presence was not accompanied by action.
I have been in therapy about this.
My therapist, who is very good, has helped me understand that I was also a child in that household, also conditioned by what I grew up inside, also lacking the framework to name what I was seeing. She has helped me understand that there is a difference between responsibility and guilt, and that I can hold responsibility for what I did and did not do without processing it through a lens of self-punishment that does not help me or Julian. Julian has been generous with me about this. More generous than I deserve, probably, though he would tell me not to put it that way. He told me once that my guilt about what I witnessed was understandable, but that he did not need me to carry it. That what he needed from me was not performed remorse but present relationship, and that the relationship we have now, honest and chosen, and built on knowing each other clearly, was more than enough. He is a better person than most people I have met. Not because of what happened to him. I refuse to frame what happened as something that made him better because he was already good and what happened was wrong, but in spite of it, and through it, because he did the work of healing with the same seriousness and intention he brings to everything. Update, written by Julian himself. Added with his permission. My sister read me this post before she published it, sitting across from me at her kitchen table with her laptop open and her voice doing that thing it does when she is trying not to show how much something is costing her. I let her finish without interrupting. When she was done, I asked if I could add something, and she said yes, as long as I said something true. Here is what is true. The most disorienting thing about growing up the way I grew up is not the dramatic moments. It is not Cooper, or the basketball list, or the panic attack in the hallway, as significant as each of those were. The most disorienting thing is the ordinary moments. The Tuesday afternoon when you come home from school mildly annoyed about something, and then realize you have no idea whether the annoyance is real. The moment in your 20s when someone who loves you asks how you are, and you have to stop and actually locate the answer rather than producing an automatic response. The first time you try to describe your own childhood to a new friend and hear yourself adding qualifiers, it was not that bad, I mean by some standards, because you are still not entirely sure whether your experience of it counts. That is what systematic invalidation produces. Not a person who cannot feel things, but a person who feels them and immediately begins interrogating the feeling, because the interrogation was trained in so early and so completely that it became the first response rather than the last. Dr. Tanaka gave me many things, but the most important one was permission to stop interrogating. Not to become incurious about my own inner life. I am endlessly curious about my own inner life, as anyone who has seen my paintings knows, but to stop asking myself whether my reactions are proportionate before I have let myself have them. To feel first and understand later, because that is the correct order, and it is the order that was reversed in me for a very long time. To the people who will read this and recognize something in it, the recognition is not a coincidence. What happened in my family happens in many families, often without names or frameworks, often carried into adulthood as an unexplained weight that makes certain things harder than they should be. The weight has a name. The name is systematic emotional invalidation, and it is a form of abuse, and it is not your fault that you learn to carry it, and you do not have to keep carrying it the same way. My feelings are real. Yours are too. That is the whole of it. To my sister, who wrote this with more honesty than I expected and more grace than she gives herself credit for. Thank you. You showed up. You're still showing up. That matters more than you know. And to Cooper, who is the best dog, and whose grief I was not allowed to have at 9 years old, and whom I still think about sometimes with the clean and uncomplicated sadness that is his due. You are always worth every tear. Note from the sister. Julian gave a talk at a high school 2 weeks after we agreed to post this. He told me afterward that 3 students came to him separately after the presentation. He said 2 of them cried. He said all 3 of them used the same phrase, "I didn't know it had a name." If that is the only thing this post does, give someone a name for something they have been carrying without one, then it was worth writing.